Hi, folks, and welcome to this panel called Part Japanese, 100% Nikkei. My name is Erin Aoyama, and I am so delighted to welcome our guests and all of you watching from home on this final day of Tadaima, our community virtual pilgrimage. So this panel, in many ways, I think, is meant to kind of mimic a conversation that might have happened at an in-person pilgrimage as a session, or maybe would have been a conversation, in between sessions or between stops on a walking tour or over a beer or two at the end of the day at the pilgrimage. So we're really excited to be able to have this kind of conversation with our guests here. So a huge thank you to Koji Lao Ozawa and Kimiko Mar, who really put this together behind the scenes. We have gathered together 5 fantastic folks who each in their own ways have thought deeply about what it means to be a multiracial person and about the importance of telling some of these stories. So thank you so much to Dr. Curtis Rooks, Megumi Nishikura, Jeff Chiba Stearns, Ken Tanabe, and Kip Fulbeck for being here with us today. Before I ask each of our esteemed guests to introduce themselves, I just want to make a quick note of the maybe obvious fact that while the 6 of us have, represent a really broad range of experiences and identities, this is by no means an attempt to provide an exhaustive account of multiracial experience and identities. So please, if you're watching along, feel free to leave some comments in the chat about your own experiences, your own thoughts, in addition to any questions that you may have as we go through, and maybe, use this as an opportunity to kick off a conversation with your family or some friends after this session. So either way, thank you so much for joining us and for helping us create this space. And let's dive in. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves and their work, and maybe talk a little bit about an early memory or experience you had with sort of contemplating and taking on thinking about your own multiracial identity. So Ken, we'll start with you.
All right. I love going first. My name is Ken Tanabe, as Erin introduced me. Thank you for that. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the founder of a project called Loving Day. For those of you who don't know, Loving Day is named after Loving versus Virginia, which is a Supreme Court decision that struck down all laws against interracial marriage in the United States. So the name Loving comes from people's last name, Richard and Mildred Loving. So it's their name. It's the name of the Supreme Court case. It's a civil rights milestone in the US. And of course, it also represents love in its most beautiful sense, between human beings. So Loving Day is June 12th, and folks around the world, I'm glad to say, celebrate it as a way to educate and to build multi-ethnic community. And I know we're doing like a, Japanese-centered kind of community panel here, but Loving Day is very open and welcoming to all sorts of folks around the world. Shout out to Jeff, who's calling in from outside of the US. Anyway, that's Loving Day in a nutshell. It's something you can celebrate at home. It's something you can share on social media with hashtag Loving Day. There have been some notable folks who have shared it. I'd say maybe I'll just mention Kamala Harris right now, since she's in the news and she's tweeted it many times. So thumbs up to that. And I also would encourage folks to, do the same thing, share family photos of yourself. It's a great way to connect with folks and remind people in your social circle once a year that there is such a thing as multi-ethnic, multiracial identity and relationships, and that we should think about it, at least on Loving Day. Anyway, I think I'm supposed to say a little bit about myself and my earliest memory of being multiracial or Hapa or mixed. So my mom likes to tell this story that when she registered me for kindergarten, they said, "What's his name?" And they wrote it down, and teachers asking, what is his age? They wrote it down. And then they were like, "What is his race?" And my mom says, "Well, his father is Japanese and I'm Belgian, I'm his mother, so he is Eurasian." And the woman looks at the form and she's like, "We don't have that. You're gonna have to pick one of the things on the form, right?" So I think she looked at me and said white, and that was it. Fast forward much later, when I founded Loving Day in the early 2000s, I was exposed to this whole new world where I found pretty much everyone on this panel in some order, probably Kip first, and discovered that there's an entire community of multi-ethnic artists, filmmakers, academics, activists. It's just like a whole nother world. We were just talking before the like this whole thing started about how there's like books on raising your kids and like all these different resources. So really excited to be here. All the panelists are folks that I know. We go back a ways. The community is real, I would say. And looking forward to this conversation. Thanks, Erin. And to Tadaima for hosting this.
Thank you so much, Ken. And yeah, I should say, when we met backstage about 30 minutes ago, it felt like a reunion of friends. It was really great. So thanks, everyone, for being here. I think, Curtis, I said you'd go next.
Okay.
I don't remember. But
Sure, I'll jump in. Hello, everyone. My name is Curtis Takada Rooks, and I'm a professor in Asian American Studies at Loyola Marymount University. In terms of my work, some of the work that I do some work in sort of mixed race identity, a bit of speaking and some other things on it. But for me, sort of looking at it, I was born in Japan to a native Japanese mother and an African-American father in the 1950s. So I have a little age on folks here, and came into some cognition before the Civil Rights Act was passed. So what I hope to offer on this panel today is sort of a broader perspective on sort of mixedness as it relates to sort of race relations, racial issues throughout our nation as well. Also, being Japanese and Black has its own sort of challenges with it within our societies, and the way in which I get read, the way in which I have to perform, and all those other things. So, earliest memories, I think. In our family, it worked pretty well. My parents were pretty upfront with it, and having a Japanese mom and we were living in Kansas at the time, who spoke Japanese, kids who spoke Japanese. I think for me, the first time it sort of struck me was when I was in kindergarten, because otherwise it was just what you did. It was, you just were. You didn't think much about it, didn't anything. But in kindergarten, we're sitting there. Doing flashcards, when you got they've got dog, they've got cat, squirrel. Well, squirrel came up, and at the time I couldn't pronounce squirrel because if you speak Japanese, those sounds just don't work. It would come out something like skuwaru or something like that. So I couldn't, but I wasn't going to be embarrassed by this teacher. So I just wouldn't answer, because in our family we called it kunchan. And so finally she said, well, what is it? I said kunchan, and she looked at me, and so we got into this sort of you can imagine a 5-year-old being willful battle with a teacher. Well, they called my parents in and told them that they should quit speaking Japanese to me because it would affect my ability to perform in school. And if I kept that sort of defiance up, that I might actually get paddled. So at that time, so you have to understand, in the early 1960s, bilingualism, or being able to speak more than one language, was looked as being un-American. We're still just coming out of the Cold War, and Japan had been our enemy. So if I was going to be American, then I needed to speak American, as it were, right? And so they literally would, for those of us who were mixed or from around as other military brats, whether the mother was German or Italian or right, we were actually punished for using other languages. And that's when, so in terms of memory, that's understanding that my normal was not the normal of society.
Thank you so much for that. And there's so much to come back to, I think, and talk about more. Both of you. Jeff, how about you?
Hi. My name is Jeff Chiba Stearns. I'm a filmmaker and illustrator from Vancouver, British Columbia. So I think that's the only Canadian amongst the group. But definitely, yeah, as Ken was saying, this is great. A nice little reunion to kind of see everyone again, because we have traveled on the same circuits for quite some time. So I kind of started off in 2005 making, I made an animation called, I got right here, What Are You Anyways? And this actually was a film that looked at all the crazy experiences that I had growing up in a small city in Canada, being mixed Japanese. I identify as mixed Japanese Canadian. I guess I'm Yonsei, 4th generation Japanese Canadian. So that was kind of one of those sort of films that brought all those experiences together into about an 11-minute film. I've kind of followed it up with another film called One Big Hapa Family, which maybe some of the people watching saw it on the Tadaima website. It was screening. This one looked at why all of my Japanese Canadian family intermarried after my grandparents' generation. And I kind of delved into 4 generations and how we self-identified as Nikkei. Follow that up with another film called Mixed Match. And this film was really important for us. It basically looked at some of the challenges multiracial people faced if they have leukemia or like a rare blood disease, and trying to find them stem cell matches. And I want to preface this by saying that people can actually sign up to the registry using this link here. I'm actually going to send that, and hopefully we can add that to the comments. So if you haven't joined the National Bone Marrow Registries like Mixed Match, please consider doing so. A lot of our subjects in the film were actually mixed Japanese American. I've kind of moved into doing kids books recently because I love kids books and I like to draw things. So I made a book called Mixed Critters recently. And this book is something I made for my 5-year-old daughter so she could see herself reflected in animals that are more than one thing, many things. And that was a book that kind of basically just mashed up a bunch of animals into an ABC story. The latest book I just did is called Nori and His Delicious Dreams. Basically looks at the story of a little mixed Japanese boy who likes to dream of sleeping in foods from around the world. So it's it inspires kids to try different things. Lastly, I got into graphic novels. So I'm doing this new graphic novel. It's just finished it up. It's 56 pages of a Japanese Canadian story that I kind of collaborated on with an artist in Canada called, her name is Lillian Blakey. And it's her sort of family story of being interned during World War II and having to work on a sugar beet farm, but also brings in the story into the present day where her granddaughter is being told the story so that she basically kind of finds a pride for her Japanese Canadian roots, I guess, being mixed Japanese herself. So yeah, kind of delved into a lot of different mixed stuff. I guess if I look back at a lot of those sort of experiences I had growing up, a lot of what is in What Are You Anyways, which you can watch on YouTube, kind of preface that. But I guess the one thing was, I think this is very common for a lot of kids when they have to, it's multicultural day and they have to bring a certain food to school. Well, back in the 80s, I believe we brought sushi to school. And that was the time when there weren't sushi restaurants in every corner of the street. So a lot of the kids were kind of poking at it and kind of turning their nose up at it. And I kind of felt really bad, that my mom had made the sushi and nobody ate it. So it was one of those kind of things where I think that really stuck with me, right? And I believe I've heard that story from a lot of different people who brought their food, from their country of origins to school. So yeah, definitely that would have been elementary school, had a pretty profound effect on just the way I sort of self-identified after that point. But that's me.
Great. Thanks so much, Jeff.
Welcome.
Kip, are you here? We just maybe can't see you.
I am, but I'll be back in a sec. I'm trying to get
no problem. So Megumi, maybe you could go next.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Megumi Nishikura. Along with Lara Perez Takagi, I directed, figuring out this way, the film Hafu, The Mixed Race Experience in Japan. It came out in 2013. Since then, I've relocated to the United States, and I have been producing and directing other films that, are what I like to call about the greater diaspora of multiracial Japanese. So I produced the documentary Fall 7 Times, Get Up 8, The Japanese War Brides, which was part of the festival last week. And then out of the current festival, I have a short film called Minadoka, which follows the experience of a Hapa, Yonsei, Gosei, who travels to Minadoka, Idaho to understand what his great-grandparents underwent during incarceration. And so, for me, I personally grew up in Japan, born and raised there. And, I think from, my earliest memories was that I was always kind of singled out for being different. In Japan, obviously, it's majority Asian, majority Japanese, and little kids that I would walk by in, the supermarket or in the playground would kind of point their fingers at me and call me gaijin, gaijinda. Gaijin is the Japanese word for foreigner. So I think, that was always, a very, difficult experience for me. And I was, I grew up always wanting to just be recognized as Japanese, or even beyond that, recognized as Hafu. But more often I would just be recognized or thought of as a foreigner. Yeah, that's my story.
Thank you
I'm
so
still
much.
working on this.
Okay.
So Erin, while Kip's doing that, I just want to let you know, for folks out there, there's a TED Talk that I have that's entitled The Intersectionalities of Growing Up Mixed. If you want to take a look at that, and you can sort of find that on YouTube under my name. And then this last Thursday, a podcast called More in Common. My interview dropped on Thursday, and it talks about a wide range of things, but sort of deals with some of the turmoil that we're going through here in the United States and some of the issues that revolve around it. So the funny part was I taped it last February before everything jumped off and before COVID got bad, but it seems that it was timely nonetheless. So, that's out there. So
that's great. Yeah, we'll put some links in the chat. Thanks, Curtis. And Kip.
Okay, I'm back.
Our final panelist. Great. Perfect timing.
Thank you for having me on here. When Koji contacted me about this, and the first question was, who else is on there? And he told me, well, that's fine, because I know everyone on here. I think Curtis and I go back the longest. When being an activist with the sort of Hapa issues was an unusual thing. There weren't many of us there. I've known Ken and Jeff and Megumi quite a long time as well. So I'm an artist, and I have made work about autobiographical work about the multiracial experience I'm 55 now, so quite a while. I've done 4 solo shows at Japanese American National Museum, and even though I'm not technically Nikkei, that's the group that I've always sort of identified the most with, because growing up as in a sort of Chinese American household with an Anglo father, it was never really talked about. My siblings were all full-blooded Chinese from China, and so I was growing up as the sort of white kid at home. Then I went to school, and I was like the Asian kid getting thrown in the trash can, rolled down the stairs, things like that. So it was this idea of sort of finding a cultural foothold was really imprinted very young, 5 years old to me. And it was funny because I think everyone here, we talk about this idea of these, Ken talks about Loving Day and so forth, and we talk about these questions having to pick one box, and Curtis talks, are you this or this or this? And this today I got a survey from professor in the UK asking me to talk about, it's 20,000 faculty asking us to talk about whether we feel safe with academic freedom. And one of the questions there was race, and it wouldn't allow me to check more than one box. And I'm like, that's today. And this is from, a pretty well-respected professor in the UK. And so I think it's really interesting that I can say that I was born at a time when my parents' marriage was illegal in many states, and people say, yeah, but you're old. I'm like, this is today. This is August 16th. So this is the last project I did, was Hapa.me project, and that's where I photographed people originally about like this. Like, there's this good-looking guy here. So he's like I like this 15 years apart, but Curtis looks better now, which I can't figure out. And so I photographed people over time, and I had them write their sort of handwritten experience or reference to like the "What are you?" question. So, Jeff's in there and Ken's in there, Megumi, you're there in spirit, and so it's all just people that are just photographing themselves, and they're all different Hapa people, and that was the last show at the Japanese American National Museum in 2018, and that's the kind of stuff I work on. And the reason I originally started showing there, even though I've always been told I'm like half Chinese, but I did my pretty extensive DNA research, and I'm much more Pacific Islander, Oceanic, no Han Chinese at all. But the reason I sort of gravitated towards the Nikkei community is that's a community that understands multiraciality and multi-ethnicity, because it's just that the outmarriage rate is so drastically higher than other Asian and Pacific Islander groups. And so, there was some pushback at my first show at JANM in 2006. There was one letter which I kept, which was like, you shouldn't be having this show here. These people are not Japanese American. They don't belong in this museum, and so forth and so on. And that was one negative thing in the overwhelmingly like positive receiving by the community. So that's how I got to know all these people, and I'm just glad to be here.
Thanks so much. And actually, Kip, I grew up in Connecticut and New England, and I remember going to JANM as a kid and seeing your book there, the first version of it, and flipping through it. And that was really a very early exposure to me of other mixed race folks who kind of looked like me, kind of didn't, kind of looked like my siblings, but just starting to understand this much larger community. So it's really wonderful to have you all here. And I think the first question I kind of want to get into that actually most of you touched on is this idea of storytelling and digging into these histories of multiracial folks, of yourselves as individuals, but as, you know, this larger community. Why for each of you has it been, you know, important to tell these stories, and how have you kind of approached this storytelling in your own work? What have been sort of the themes that you've really latched onto, the questions that you've wanted to dig into? And I'm asking this to all of you, so we'll see who starts talking first. But really, whatever direction you want to take that question in, I'm just struck by the fact that each of you, in your own ways, is a storyteller, and how important that seems to be to the work you do.
Well, I wanted to say, because Kip said his age, and I met Kip when he was 41 in Santa Barbara, because I actually had picked up that book that Erin's talking about, and this is me grabbing stuff from my shelf, but you can see all the post notes in here. I went through this exhaustively when I first saw this book, and to me, it was like the first time I ever saw myself represented in any kind of a book. And that was around the time I did What Are You Anyways? And it was in the Newport Beach Film Festival. Someone's like, you got to talk to Kip. And I was like, Kip, the guy who did the book? And they're like, yeah, I guess he was photographed for the book. So he got me in touch with Kip. I drove up to Santa Barbara on my way up to San Francisco. Kip was cool. He was like, yeah, let's meet in a coffee shop. I still remember this whole experience because to me, you know, being the guy who just saw this and getting to meet, you know, the author and the photographer, and I remember from that meeting, Kip saying, you know, I'm like, well, is it cool that I'm working in this area, what you're doing? And he's like, dude, the more people are doing this, like, you know, the more people that are doing this work, the better. And that to me struck me really like, you know, the heart. And that kept me going, right? That's what kept me making more of these stories and realizing that there is a thirst for it. There's a need for it because as we're moving in, you know, to the future, we're just getting more and more mixed and blended. So I think we're at a really cool time right now to tell these stories because, you know, we have them, you know, within ourselves to tell. I just wanted to jump in and say that because, you know, being on this panel is kind of giving me a little bit of nostalgia, a little bit of, you know, it's neat to kind of see everyone again in this format. It's too bad we have to be so distant, but at the same time, we're so close together. And, you know, even just remembering that story, you know, after Kip was speaking, I just wanted to say that before I wanted to get a chance. So that's what I'm going to say on that.
I remember that meeting very clearly because, you know, Jeff wrote me and he's like, you know, he was so respectful. It's like, you know, it felt like he was like coming to this elder and saying like, I'm like, dude, I'm just like, you know, I was just making this stuff in college like you were, you know. And he came and he showed me, I'm like, just absolutely, we need so much more of this stuff. And I started as a filmmaker. Jeff is 10 times the filmmaker I ever was. And I was like, I'm looking at the stuff that everyone here is doing. And I look at what's happening now with COVID. And, you know, this is the first time like in modern history that we don't have to rely on Warner Brothers or Sony or you know, Paramount or any of these companies to sort of put us out there because people are able to work outside the system or work within systems, even if it's something like Twitter or TikTok or YouTube, which is now owned by Google, but it's like people are still finding these niches to tell stories, and there is this huge audience. And the thing I always say to my audiences, I'm like, you know, when was the last time you went to a major Hollywood film and felt your story was told? And you know, if you go see freaking Big Mama's House 7, you don't leave here saying like my story's been told. It's like, you know, every film that's in the theaters is either a sequel to something or it's an adaptation of a comic book because that's proven to make money. So when you have Tom Cruise, you know, doing another Top Gun, and then we have, you know, the pressure from China that they take off the Taiwanese flag and so forth, and people just kind of goes over their head. But meanwhile, it's like we need people like Jeff and Megumi making this work, and we need scholars like Curtis, and we need activists like Ken. This is really important.
You know, for me, I began sort of the public work in this in the 80s as places after moving to California. You know, we started the Amerasia League. Delaney Houston, Phil Nash, a number of folks. But we began doing panels and talks and sort of keynotes for Japanese American Citizenship League. When JANM first opened, doing a number of panels. One of the things that struck me through all of this is that in the notion of the tragic mulatto, which is one of the tropes out there about people who are mixed. And that just didn't fit with my life. And that didn't make sense. And so if I had to say in my storytelling, if I had a theme that I keep coming back to, is that I'm just a different normal. You're just a different normal, right? We have our own normal. That sort of being mixed is, right? That's neither harder nor easier. And in fact, I reject the notion that it's harder, because I can't be anything other than who I am and what I am, right? And so it just is. It's complicated sometimes. It just is. Do tragic things happen to us? Absolutely. But they're not of our making usually, right? That's like that teacher who pulled me in and wanted to paddle me for using a different language. The problem was her problem, not mine. And so I think one of the things that I hope I've been able to do with the speaking I've done and even the classes that I teach classes on one class called Multiracial Americans in the American Imagination. And another class called Mixed Race Voices, which we only read works of people of mixed race background to see if there is a voice and whatever that voice is, and that my students get to sort of discover that piece of it. But if there's any takeaway I want them to come away with from that, is that, it's a different normal. We don't have to be either in the trope of being hybrid vigor and we're going to save the world and everybody's going to be blended. We're going to be, we're the super race type of deal, or that we're tragic, right? Most of us are just plain kitchen table normal, right? If we don't brush our teeth, our breath stinks. So, it's just the way it goes.
All right.
Yeah, I think for me, making Hafu in Japan, my motivation for, trying to tell the story was that I left Japan at the age of 15 and then moved to the United States. I went to high school and college and then decided to go back to Japan for graduate school. And in the almost, I think, 11 or 12 years that I was outside of Japan and came back, I noticed a visible change, especially in Tokyo, where I was, where I grew up, of how many, international people there were, how many kind of mixed families there were, and Hafu children that were being born. But I didn't see a deeper understanding about their experiences, despite kind of what I saw visually. And so I think part of my motivation to tell the story of Hafus in Japan is really because I saw that gap and wanted to, kind of change the perception of what that, what the Hafu experience is for the average Japanese person. Because there are many Hafus who are models and TV presenters on television. And, they tend to, because of, the medium of TV, they want attractive people, they want, well-spoken and, a whole list of things. It ends up being a very narrow kind of experience of Hafus. And so in the film, we followed 5 different stories, and I think we just wanted to show as many different experiences. And of course, like this panel discussion, it's it's not exhaustive of all the different types of experiences there are in Japan. But I think that kind of we wanted to start that dialogue and to help create a recognition of the diversity within the Hafu community, and then hopefully start to change Japan by helping them to recognize the kind of new generation of Japanese that are emerging.
I wanted to say to Megumi, I really love the work that you've done, because I lived in Japan in the late 1970s, and when Hafu was a pejorative. I was born there, left, came back, and lived on Okinawa for a time in the late 70s, late 60s, early 70s, and then in 78 was in Tokyo. And the way in which your generation has reappropriated that term and given it power and empowering, I find just absolutely wonderful and fascinating. And it's a much richer story than people know. And so thank you so much for that work.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind words. And so, I've just since then, wanted to continue. And what, Jeff was saying earlier about, I just recognized in making that film how hungry people were for these stories. The response in Japan and the response worldwide. I mean, the film has screened, basically every continent except for Antarctica. And, we've just got so many messages of appreciation and thanks from just so many different people. And, I think that recognition in me that, there is this hunger, there is this thirst to see oneself represented on the big screen. And that's part of why I've continued to, seek out stories and find, these different avenues for, the war brides, the children of women who married U.S. servicemen. And then now with Minidoka, the story of, Hapa, whose family came through, the U.S. in World War II incarceration. So there's all these different avenues of how we've all become multiracial Japanese. And I hope to continue to do that.
So, Erin, when you said storytelling, I was like, ooh, she said the magic word. I got so much to say about this. Good. I know others do too on this panel, but you might be wondering, hey, this is a project, Loving Day, named after a Supreme Court case. What does that have to do with storytelling? But I'll just go big here. I'd say storytelling is how human beings understand the world. It's how we understand history. It's how we understand ourselves as individuals. Like everyone's identity is basically a story, so the experts say, and I believe. But just to rewind back to when I was working on this project, it was my graduate thesis, actually, in graphic design, hence like this and other parts of the campaign. But in the beginning, I was like, I actually thought I was going to make a film. I don't know if you knew that, Megumi and Jeff. And then I realized that was a terrible idea because I don't know how to do that. And then I thought I'd make a website, but then it's like, why? Because it's basically just, it's the same as you might read in a book. And then the idea of having like an actual day came up after lots of research. And I was like, this is such a crazy idea. It's insane. Why should we do this? But then I realized, when people understand civil rights, at least the teaching of it in the United States, it's like Rosa Parks on the bus. There's a story, right? And that's how you teach kids about the civil rights movement. And then with Loving, they're like, there was a couple and they wanted to get married and they weren't allowed to. And the police came and arrested them in their bedroom while they were asleep at night, and then you can kind of tell the whole story of how the Lovings fought this 9-year battle to get to the Supreme Court and finally win their rights. So storytelling, I feel like, was a huge part of starting Loving Day. But then as it expanded from what I thought it was, like an educational project, I mean, it still is that, but the community aspect has been so strong. Watching people, I'm going to quote Curtis here on The Different Normal, because I remember like hosting, we would host before COVID, we would host these big events in New York, and they'd happen all over the world. But for the ones in New York, they got big at a certain point, like 1,000 people would show up. And folks would come in and you could almost watch on people's face as it dawns on them that they're the majority in this huge event for the first time in their entire lives. And it's like whatever conception you had of yourself before has been changed. And when you think about the Loving case, so many folks, even with like a multi-ethnic, multiracial heritage, don't understand that history. And then it helps ground them in that history as well. It's like you are connected to this larger movement that, just hearing Curtis talk about his experience in the 1970s and not too far after the Loving decision, 1967. So, seeing all that come together, experiencing that new normal, and then bringing that into like a more modern time where Loving was a Hollywood film. Totally blew. I didn't think I'd see it in my lifetime, right? So many great steps have happened. By the way, went to the premiere in New York and got to meet everyone who was there. And for the only time ever, so LA people, you'll know what I'm talking about. The only time my whole life I could go and like approach a famous actor and be like, I'm that guy. I'm the Loving Day guy. And they're like, you're the Loving Day guy? I'm like, yeah. Better enjoy this because I will never achieve this level of recognition again in my life. But anyway, it's really like a life-changing thing. But it's amazing, to Kip's point, how much we still have to go on so many fronts when it comes to race and identity. Just starting on the little stuff, like what shows up on a form, for example. And even like Kamala Harris, who just got the VP pick. They're like, who is Kamala Harris and what is her identity? I'm like, here we go again. You know what I mean? Like, we're gonna have to explain this all over again because people still need that framework. So I feel like there's work to do in that space, and frankly, quite so much more work to do in the space of race in America right now.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And actually, I wanted to go back from there to something, Curtis, you said about thinking about mixedness and its relationship to race relations throughout history, but then especially in this moment that we're in right now, I think is something that, you know, under having a better understanding of these relationships and how those of us who identify as multiracial or mixed can sort of help this ongoing conversation around race in the United States, I'm thinking specifically, but really and truly around the world. What do you see? We'll start with you, Curtis, maybe, since you brought this up, and then, you know, anyone jump in. But what do you see as that relationship between multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural identity and the larger questions of race relations?
Well, you know, I'm a social scientist and I do critical race and critical mixed race. And if I want to understand how a society thinks about race or what their beliefs are about race, I look at the multiracial subject in that society, where they're valued, whether they're shunned, whether it was, you know, all the different things that go with it, right? Are they sacred or are they profane, right? And you learn a lot about how race works in that society. Even when we look at mix, when you look at someone who's mixed with Black versus Japanese and white, you'll fall in different places within that, right? But I think one of the things that I would say that allows some of us the potential to work in these spaces is that we also understand the notion of fluidity. You know, we can move in and out of our various identities, and they're not contradictions to us, right? They're fully ourselves. I've been blessed with being able to help lead a conversation on Blackness at my alma mater at Dartmouth College with my graduating class. And, you know, in that space right now, sort of, I'm forefronting my Black identity, right? I didn't leave my Japanese identity away, but I'm forefronting the other. In situations and cases with, I'm doing another panel with a group of young people in Japan on Black Lives Matter, but I will do it probably from a Japanese Black perspective, right? And so I'll forefront my Japaneseness in those conversations and how that intersects with my Blackness. So I do believe that we have the potential to do those things, right? Particularly if we have been in environments that allowed us to be thoughtful and reflective on our identity. But at the same time, as I said, as we look at the mixed race subject, we can certainly call out societies on their myths about race in a heartbeat.
Yeah, I love that. That both this idea of the different normal and the fluidity is so powerful to think about. And I'm wondering, just because it's come up and it came up before we started this panel, this idea of critical mixed studies, what is that looking like? Like who is taking those classes? What are those conversations that are happening within and outside of universities and schools? That's, again, a question for anyone.
So would it be okay to answer the question you asked before?
Yeah,
that
absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, great. And then we could flow however y'all want to. So when George Floyd was murdered, that was May 25th. Loving Day is June 12th. So if you do the math on the calendar, there was a very short window between those two events. And you had asked, what do you see as a relationship between multiracial identity and race relations? I feel like working on Loving Day, that is kind of exactly what we had to answer in a way that had to be meaningful and address the moment. So if you go to lovingday.org right now, as it has been for since around that time, it's a Black Lives Matter statement. But it is one that I feel is very particularly rooted in the community that we're talking to right now, right? The mixed multiracial relationships, multi-ethnic individuals. Curtis talked about fluidity of identity. So if you look at our statement, there's a few different things. It talks about how, you know, every year as a multi-ethnic community, we come together around Loving Day and we have this like elevated voice and presence, and we can trend on Twitter and we can show up in news articles around that time of year. It just happens. So using that platform to talk about racial justice. And then talking about fluidity too, one of the parts of the statement was we do have these fluid identities which allow us to walk into rooms that other people don't necessarily walk into, right? So that brings us another opportunity to talk about Black lives and racial justice. So like there are so many other things. There's like a dozen things in that statement that you can read through that directly connect what I think is, you know, a strong bond between these communities. And not only that, the Loving Day community, the multiracial community, like is the Black community, right? Like we are connected. They are part of our community. It's not like we're talking about someone else, even if it's not our own personal way that we identify. So I just wanted to highlight that, you know, and the way that these things are connected. I feel pretty directly, and that we as multi-ethnic people have like a unique kind of way that we can engage in that conversation and make change.
I forgot your other question, Erin.
Yeah.
And that's okay. We don't need to. I was just kind of personally curious, but about critical mixed studies that's happening right now. Both a couple of you have mentioned what that's looking like. But if that's not an interesting question, we can also move along. Come back to that later.
It is, but Ken's point is really solid that everything is sort of through the focus of Black Lives Matter right now. It's just, I mean, and the combination of that with COVID, you know, universities and colleges aren't going to be the same.
Right.
Education is completely changing, and many are going to go under, and it's just going to be it's a complete etch-a-sketch time. Whoa, that's a really good etch-a-sketch. But it's a time where we're really sort of revamping everything, and I'm really encouraging my colleagues who are just for the first time sort of really understanding that, wow, this racism really exists. Like, I'm encouraging them not to like try and piggyback, you know, like we can't just jump in and say, well, yeah, but Asians are getting anti-COVID stuff. Or what about LGBTQ? What if it's like, we're not getting killed by police. This is a very different issue. It's much bigger. And I think I know Ken and I talked, you know, I'll just share Ken without sharing too much. It's like, we didn't know what to do for Loving Day because we were supposed to do a panel and so forth. But at the same time, it's like, how do you do this panel when this larger issue, which is also our issue, is coming to the front? And I think that Ken had a really interesting strategy of taking that on by what he did here. I think it speaks to him that he didn't stick to like, this is my issue. No, it's part of a larger universe.
Well, and I want to say, you know, it's also part of the Japanese American history and Japanese American, Japanese Canadian community, right? It's not over there, right? My wife is Sansei, but she worries every time I'm out because I could be George Floyd. I mean, I couldn't watch the George Floyd video for the first week and a half. I knew how it ended. I knew what it was, but it was too painful. And I'm 63, you know, and have been through those things myself. But just to see that, but you know, you have cousins and aunties and uncles and others who live that reality when your family is married into the Black community, that's something that has become part of their own identity in the way in which they sort of negotiate the world. And so I really think that there's a lot of work that we can do in our Nikkei community, right? To get outside of ourselves sometime, to recognize just how interconnected we are. And it's not a theoretical interconnectedness, right? For the Black Nikkei, that interconnectedness is our bodies, right? It's embodied, it's literally embodied in the Japanese American in the Nikkei community.
Curtis, the perfect example is when Trump tried to propose a Muslim ban and how the Nikkei community reacted to that. That was led by Nikkei. That everyone, with the entire movement to like register and say, well, I'm going to say that I'm Islamic, I'm Muslim, and overwhelm the system, because that's the only group we've had that's been the victims of concentration camps, you know, in the U.S. And so I thought that was an amazing way that the Japanese American community realized they are part of a larger mission.
I'd like to quickly add that there are connections that go way back. I think about the Loving decision quite a lot, as you might imagine, but I also think about how the Japanese American Citizens League filed an amicus brief in support of the Lovings, along with the NAACP. So I feel like sometimes people, I've actually been asked by folks, and I think they mean this in a positive way, like, why are you working on this? And I think the subtext is because you are, Belgian and Japanese, like, this doesn't really affect you in some way. I mean, I think Hapa folks will disagree with that. But my answer is, it goes way back. It's part of the answer. And also because I do feel affected personally, about needing to do something. And so even if it's Loving Day is a small piece in a very large machine, and people are doing more important work than I am, but trying to at least support and help that.
Yeah. And I think, just across the board, for however we may identify, for those of us who live within the United States, it's part of what we inherit. I think it's the history of Japanese American concentration camps, but it's also the history of the enslavement of Africans and genocide of Native Americans. So it's just part of sort of expanding that fluidity, Curtis, that you talked about, also of our identities, to understand that, where we are now is also a matter of inheritance, and owning that history and doing our best to understand it and see those interconnections, both within individuals, but then within our communities and where we live, and taking that on as a responsibility too. Yeah. Sorry, Megumi, were you going to say something?
Oh, no, I mean, I just wanted to share just kind of, the perspective from Japan. Like, I know that, I found it very encouraging. There were numbers of demonstrations or marches within Tokyo and other cities for Black Lives Matter. And I think, there was a question in the comments about some of the kind of athletes, and particularly like Naomi Osaka, Rui Hachimura, who is a basketball player in the NBA, and a baseball player named Luis Okoye. There are people, Black Hafus, who are speaking up and using their platforms to show their support for Black Lives Matters within Japan. And I think that's really encouraging. And, I think that's a great change that we're seeing. I mean, the question in the comments was kind of like, how has public attitudes changed? And I think, what we're seeing is that in Japan, there has been a dominant of kind of the white Hafu as, the ideal image of a Hafu. That's the TV presenter and the model. And that's what people generally think, a Japanese person would generally think, oh, Hafu, that's who I think of. But now we're seeing more and more, prominent people in sports. And then also most recently, or I guess in the last 5 years, like Miss Universe Japan, Ariana Miyamoto, and then Priyanka Yoshikawa, who was like a year later, who is Indian and Japanese. We're starting to see that diversity, not just the white Hafu being represented within Japan. And I think that's very encouraging. And yeah, I think that is shifting the public perception within Japan. So I think going forward, I think, it's just a matter of time. For me, I really think it's a numbers game. I think that, sadly, Japan's, has a declining birth rate and an aging population. But when we were making this film, Hafu, there was about 1 in 49 babies born were of somebody between a Japanese and a non-Japanese parent. And I think that kind of, as the babies decrease, maybe percentage-wise, the multiracial, the mixed Japanese will increase. And, right now we're only seeing TV presenters and athletes, but we're going to start seeing business people. We're going to start seeing politicians, and there actually is a couple of politicians. I know there's Denny Tamaki, who is the, I think, governor of Okinawa, who is Hafu. And so, we're just going to see more and more mixed Japanese within Japan, representing Japan kind of within and on the world stage. And that's very exciting.
Oh gosh, I need to jump in just very quickly because Megumi said Rui Hachimura. I don't know if anyone watches Terrace House around here. Erin does, apparently. Terrace House, a reality show from Japan about young folks living in a house, kind of like Real World. Anyway, if you're familiar with the show, there's a commentator. There's a room full of commentators, pretty common in Japanese TV. And Rui Hachimura was one of the guest commentators. He did a great job. But I was really moved by his introduction when he said, I'm famous now for being in the NBA, and everyone tries to get me to be on these shows, panels, to make media appearances, and he declines pretty much everything, or so he said. And he said, but I accepted the Terrace House commentator slot because it's the only show I see on TV where there are mixed Japanese people, consistently. So I was like, wow, Rui Hachimura, I thought you were cool before, but now this is Hapa respect moment right now. This seemed like the right panel to bring that up.
That's awesome. And we are fast approaching the hour here, but so audience members, if you have questions or comments, please do put those in the chat. I think just because we've been talking so much, I think about this present moment that we're in right now and our responsibility as individuals, as mixed race folks. I'm wondering if each of you could talk a little bit about what you see, what your hopes are for, the future of these kinds of conversations about multiracial identities, but then also what's the work? What can those of us who've spent the last 9 weeks participating in Tadaima, this pilgrimage, learning about our histories as Nikkei and our connections to communities that are so close to us, what can we leave folks with going forward? What are, steps, things to think about, things to read, folks to listen to? What's the work that we can keep doing and keep having some of these really powerful and important conversations?
Yeah, I'll jump in because I'm thinking, what's really cool even with this panel is, there's a festival called Hapa Japan, and it kind of used to run every 4 years. And I believe, basically Ken, Megumi, and myself are on the advisory board. And it's a place where it combined, obviously, sort of that academic discourse around the subject of being multiracial, especially Nikkei, mixed Japanese, but also brought together the arts and the music, the culture that was sort of, being brought to the forefront by a lot of really great artists. And, even in Canada, we started Hapapalooza back in 2011 as a way to, again, celebrate, what it means to be mixed, I guess, in the Canadian context, but also a international context. And it's sort of, I've been thinking a lot about it, too, because the One Big Hapa Family film really looked at and addressed this sort of stat. The National Association of Japanese Canadians was saying that 95% of all Japanese Canadians were intermarrying. Which is high, right? Meaning that all kids being born are going to be self-identifying as somewhat mixed in that sense. And One Big Hapa Family was released in 2010. So this year would have been its 10th year anniversary. And this year I had all these panels lined up with special screenings of the film to address, this sort of Hapas, Hafus, and the future of Japanese Canadian identity. Because I wanted to sort of see how it shifted, how it's changed over the last 10 years. And unfortunately, COVID definitely put a monkey wrench in that one because they were live screenings, right? So we've kind of shifted to do more online work, and especially with Tadaima, I think this has been really great because the conversation is continuing. There's a lot more dialogue and discussion around these topics, and again, people are creating more work on these topics as well. So, I feel that it's great because it's creating things like Hapa Japan, it's creating things like Hapapalooza, it's creating things like Loving Day. There's a lot more of these things coming out of a lot of this discussion. And, even with that Critical Mixed Race Studies conference, every time we go, there's always new groups, new student groups that are coming up that are leading the charge on, talking about this stuff and creating groups where they can have the safe sort of discourse with each other. So I guess just to preface that, that's sort of where I this is all to me seeing there's just a lot more conversations happening, and especially with this panel, it's really exciting, and even Facebook, you see all these Hapa, Hafu Facebook groups, and there's thousands of members, right? So there's obviously a place for these conversations to happen, and they need to happen.
I could
Sure.
go next.
Yeah, and we have some questions coming in too, so feel free to sprinkle in responses to those if you'd like. But no pressure.
Cool. So I would okay. I would just draw. I'm gonna try and draw a comparison, but you'll see where I'm going with this. Okay, so John Lewis passed away about a month ago. That was July 17th. And I remember having a conversation with a friend who was deeply moved by his passing. And so was I, but this friend was like, emotional. And my way of consoling her was that if there was ever a time for John Lewis to pass away, it would be now, because he lived to see so many hands stepping into the space to like support the work that he has been doing. And that seemed to make my friend feel at least somewhat better about his passing. So none of us is John Lewis, not even remotely close. Sorry, everybody. I count myself in that, but it's in that spirit that I would say my hope for these kinds of conversations is that everyone on this panel will not be as necessary in the future, and we can all retire with a clear conscience and feel like the work will be carried. I'm serious. The work will be carried on by other folks, and sometimes I see signs of that, by all of you, by everyone in their art and films and academic work, TED Talks, Curtis, all the stuff that you're putting out there. Loving Day, we were in USA Today this year. It reached a lot of people, trended on Twitter. All those things give me hope, but it's definitely not the end. For my own work, I see there's so much work to be done, and I recognize my own limitations, and I'm not good at everything. But one thing I feel I can help with is the education part of it. I feel like Loving Day is pretty good at providing that tip of the iceberg kind of like introduction to the subject matter, and then helping folks to act with agency to educate folks around them. And perhaps then community becomes the tool by which we do the work. Again, recognizing the limitations of us as individuals, but if we see ourselves as a community that can all lean in and kind of work together, then I see a lot of hope in that.
Thanks, Ken.
Yeah, I would also piggyback on that and just say, like, I encourage people to, express and explore as they want to themselves, because I think when we were making Hafu, people would be like, well, why didn't you include somebody who was half Filipino? Or why didn't you include, and people came up with us and talked to us like, what they wanted and what they didn't see the film had. And for me, the answer was always, well, like, please tell your own story. There are so many stories to be told, and they're all so important and so valuable. And I think there's just, as we've all said throughout this talk, like an audience that's eager to hear and share these stories. And, I think people should feel to express whatever form it comes out in music or art or writing, to tell their own experience. And I just cannot encourage that enough.
I'd agree with that, and I would tag on to what Curtis said about the intersectionality that I do want, and I love Ken's idea that we can retire. That's such a great idea. But we really need more stories out there. But it's so important that they're not living in a vacuum, that you have to realize that when you're creating your work as a Nikkei or as a Hapa or Hafu, that you are tied into these other issues that are larger, that are part of your story, that you're tied into climate change, and you're tied into voter suppression and what's happening with the postal service, and you're tied into disinformation and Facebook, and you're tied into women's rights, and you're tied into trans rights, and it's like all these issues are part of your story, and you have to take that responsibility. It's not just a thing like, well, what about me? No one's talking about me. You are part of something much larger. And I was fortunate enough to have, the mentors like Paul Spickard and Su Cheng Chang and Jan and Christine Hall and Evelyn Huda Hart, and then Curtis and our peers, people like Belina Houston and Teresa Williams and Leon and Cindy Nakashima, Reg Dan. There's just so many of these people that we had this community, but we were all working as activists as well as scholars and artists and writers and playwrights. And I think it's important to look at the larger picture.
Evelyn Huda Hart is one of my favorite teachers right now. She's at Brown and just wonderful. Life-changing. Yeah.
I think what I hear everyone saying is we bring our whole selves to the conversation, right? I love, Stephen Murphy Shigematsu's book, When Half is Whole. We bring our whole self to the conversation. As a social scientist, I love that I can do work where I'm an inside-outsider at times, and other times I'm an outside-insider, right? So I get to wrestle with whatever topic that I'm looking at and want to do. Like I hope to be in Japan next year if we can be mobile again, and looking at this notion of Hafu, both the movie and Hafu to Hafu, which is a book that's similar to something that Kip did, and this notion of reappropriation. Now, again, not that everybody agrees with that, not that but it's a movement to say, look, we're not crazy, right? And your life your experiences are crazy, and there are other stories to be told. And as a social scientist, I think I'm pretty pedantic most of the time. So I love poems. I love poets. I love the way in which artists create and voice things that, quite frankly, we can never voice in social science. We're not allowed to. But it's a sense and sensibility of understanding. And so, and I would also say that in terms of one of the ways in which we can do things is how we deal with and how we talk with kids, right? How we lift them up, regardless of whether they're mono, mixed, whatever, how we lift them up so that they know that they matter, right? I think so much of our world is such that people don't let other people know that they matter, right? If I would say it at its most basic level, right? Social justice is making sure that every person knows that they matter, right? And we can all do that, right? In every interaction we have with every person we meet along the way, whether it's the person taking your money as a parking attendant back in the day, where you can say, thank you, I hope you're having a great day, so that they know that they matter, right? It's not, and I think in our hurriedness, right? In our hurriedness, we don't do that. And growing up in a mixed experience where people wanted to make you tragic and not have you matter, and if you did matter, you mattered negatively. I can draw on that to know what it feels like to say to someone, thank you for being, right? And we do that, and you can do that in any walk of life, in any way that you do. And that's the work I think that we continue, because we'll get to the place that we all desire and dream of.
So I'd like to build on that and also try to tie in some of the comments and questions that I see coming through here. I personally feel quite lucky to have been so close to the work of everyone on this panel. But I want to build on what Curtis said about showing up as your authentic self and how people, I think, are how that touches people. And maybe I'll start with Kip's work there. Because Kip, the number of people that I've met that said that your work is the first time that they ever saw themselves represented in anything. And it was their first exposure to the idea that there even was such a thing as like a identity that they could relate to is enormous. And I feel like I've physically seen that at the Japanese American National Museum in LA, at events that you've had, and seeing people, show up in that way. And Megumi, I had the pleasure of, when she was in Japan, I stood in for her at a screening of Hafu at the Asian American International Film Festival, and it was like had to be Megumi to like answer questions and stuff. And people were like, "Thank you for making this film," like in tears, like I can't believe that I've, like this it resonated with me so much. I was like, I didn't make the film, but I will tell Megumi this is happening. Jeff, we had a screening at Columbia University in New York, had that same experience with you. Having people resonate. So to tie into some comments here. There's talk about the label Hapa, the label Hafu, and the way that those things have come to life. I've also seen mentions of specific Japanese athletes like Naomi Osaka. And I would just address those things by saying, like, first look at the way that it's connecting, changing people's lives, the emotional resonance and the meaning. And then let's also then talk about like the particularities of the way they're expressed. Naomi Osaka's mom tweeted about Loving Day, and I just about lost it. I was like, she knows that we exist. I love Naomi Osaka, whatever. And when it comes to Hafu and Hapa, like watching people's response, like connecting with the work of folks on this panel that use the words Hapa, Hafu, or One Big Hapa Family, for example, like that's been very meaningful to me. And I'm not trying to sidestep the question, but I also feel like that's a really important part of the conversation about that terminology.
And we do have to sort of acknowledge when, particularly in the notion of Hapa and sort of the indigeneity of Hawaii and the sovereignty of Hawaii, right? That to be able to sort of engage in those conversations, in ways that are meaningful and understand that. So I know for myself, I probably use Hapa less now than I did before. Not because I think it's any less meaningful, because it was so meaningful for me when I was given the label, when we were, was about 12, 13, living on Okinawa. And this was right when America was going through a lot of the turmoil in 68, 69, 70. And so and all naming, we went from being Negro to Black to Afro-American, all those different things. And so we were all sort of, as 13-year-olds, doing our sort of nascent political commentary with each other, trying to like be big-headed. And I had a really good friend from Hawaii, and I said, well, what should I call myself, right? He goes, well, you're Hapa Afro. And, at that age, having that name, I never had any problem from then on in terms of sort of internally with my identity as being mixed, because I had a name. Now, was part of that name stolen from the Native Hawaiians? Absolutely, in certain respects, right? And yet, it gave me being, and understanding that, though, I can also say back, I no longer need that. There's other ways I can express myself and show respect for those who feel like their sovereignty is being sort of taken away, and I would never want to do that.
I need to respond to Curtis, my friend, because I think that's a really, really important point. I encourage people to read Keau Naismith, who's an indigenous Kanaka Maoli, Hawaiian indigenous speaker and linguist and PhD in linguistics, who teaches Hawaiian language at UH, and he wrote this amazing essay in the Hapa.me catalog where he talks about this. He talks about the word being borrowed from English, then being borrowed back, and he's like, well, who are the people, the judges, who decide who can take and who can use when language is losing around so much? And so people ask me, like, well, how do you feel? I think people should be able to call themselves whatever they want to call themselves, but be aware of what you're using. That's the way I look at it. So, I mean, having lived, and worked in Hawaii, I've never sort of ever had an issue with the word itself. But I see a lot of it written about online, which is not a real place to me. I think people that get behind keyboards get very brave, that are not very brave or in real life. And so I sort of reached out to Dr. Naismith. I said, would you be interested in writing about this? He's like, oh yeah. It's like, I'm really interested in that, because he's talking about how language is never owned by anybody. And as much as I can say I'm supportive of the pro-sovereignty movement of the native land of Hawaii, which was taken by the U.S., then I would disagree with Curtis on whether that was stolen or not, but respectfully.
I think it's good to preface too, like, I grew up my entire life calling myself half Japanese, right? And I think a lot of people do, refer to themselves when that "what are you" question is presented to them. And over time, I realized that I was breaking myself down in a really negative way. And that really started to affect me. So, a lot of kids now, when I speak to kids, especially I have two, I guess, Hapa 2.0 kids, when I discovered the word Hapa back in 2000, it really kind of, gave me that sort of sense of identity that I could be whole, not this half all the time. And I think that's really what we're trying to sort of maybe move away from, is this idea of the fraction, at least for myself and my kids, because now my wife is also mixed Japanese Canadian. She has a Japanese Canadian dad, European mother. And so same with myself. And so one of our kids, right? I don't think I'd want my kids saying that they're half, when they're really two halves of two halves of two, it just gets messy, right? So, I think that's where I like the idea that, we can find the sense of, Nikkei identity within, the sense that we can still identify as many other different things, be part of. And, I think in Canada, especially because we have such a large sort of Sansei, Yonsei, and Gosei, these generations are so mixed, we have to sort of look at how, we can identify as Nikkei and, still participate within the community in a way that we can feel that sense of wholeness, not just like you're part of, you don't belong. And I think that's something where we'll have to look at that more in the future as we get more and more blended, right? But at the end of One Big Happy Family, I think it was Audrey Kobayashi says, it's great because our community is getting bigger. because we're bringing more people into it. Even though there's not as much Japanese coming to Canada, more people are marrying into our community, and therefore it's getting bigger as a Japanese Canadian whole. So we have to look at, what is Japanese Canadian, what is Japanese American, especially, in generations from now.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm really glad that we've brought the conversation to this point, because I think this question of using the term Hapa and Hafu, which I'm less familiar with, but is an important one for us to be talking about if we're thinking about, so many of us said being given that term Hapa was so meaningful to have sort of an identifier. But I think it's also really important that as we're thinking about the fluidity of being mixed race and carrying with us multiple histories and identities, that we're not taking from someone else. So I think this is a conversation that I've been having within my own family, because my grandfather grew up on Hawaii. And so having that term Hapa, when we went to visit our aunties, was so meaningful and so fun to sort of connect to something bigger than just our family. But it's also something that, in having conversations with friends and colleagues who are Native Hawaiian and understanding, we need to be able to have our identities and our mixedness without taking from or erasing another experience. So I think I go back to, Curtis, your discussion of fluidity. And I think that's so important to recognize that there are terms that can be really meaningful, and then that eventually we need to let go of in some ways, or have, nuanced conversations about them. So I'm glad that we're having this conversation and not shying away from it, because it's important on many levels, I think.
And I think growing up mixed too is that we've recognized we have multiple identities and we flow in and out of them. And so someone recently asked me sort of, you've used this term mixed race, and then you've used multiracial, and you use that. I said, I'm all those individually and at once. We're all in, right? And so being able to sort of again be conscious of the setting that I'm in, and I think we can, whatever terms that we use, we can do that respectfully. And I think that as long as we sort of express that respectfulness. And so, when I speak with Native Hawaiian friends, I thank them graciously for having a word that became something that allowed me to be, right? And that any harm that may have come was certainly not intended. And in that spirit, I hope you can appreciate and love me for who and what I've become.
So if I may, yeah, okay. To build on that, I just want to make it clear, I intentionally held back on the Hapa stuff because I thought that other folks on this panel would jump in with some very meaningful commentary, and I feel like that happened. So thank you to folks who did, Curtis and Kip especially. But yeah, and then I would just add to that a little tale. I was actually traveling to the Hapa Japan conference in LA, catching one of those airport shuttle rides, and to do that, there's usually someone on the curb helping you find the shuttle. And so I see the guy, and he's like, "What's your name?" And I'm like, "Ken Tanabe." And he's like, that's right, the guy with the Hapa name. And I was like, what? And he says, yeah, I knew it right away, Hapa name, And I was like, what's going on? Like, how do you know about Hapa names? He's like, well, I'm from Hawaii. And I was like, what's your name? He's like, Keanu. Anyway, it was this moment. I was like, you're never going to believe where I'm going to the Hapa Japan conference. And I presented at that conference. I opened with that story. I was like, I can't believe that someone saw me as being Hapa. But also to add to what Curtis was saying, I feel like that multiple identities thing, shout out to Maria Pipi Root and her documents about the ways that we can express ourselves as mixed folks. I feel like that comes to life all the time for me, and something I share almost immediately with folks who are new to the community, and I feel like it never gets irrelevant, even on a panel of experts right now.
Yeah, and I just want to kind of add a little bit about the term Hafu. Obviously, we named a film of it, and it's wase ego, which is kind of English loanword into the Japanese language. And so, sometimes people accidentally, when they're writing about a film, they'll call the film the half film. but we didn't call it the half film. We called it the Hafu film, even though it is derived from the English word half. We really see it as a Japanese word in itself, and it means somebody who has one Japanese parent and one non-Japanese parent. And I think, you know, in terms of kind of reclaiming that terminology, you know, that's part of why we called the film that way. And we feel, you know, the filmmakers and everybody involved in it, we felt a lot of pride in identifying that way and wanting to kind of send that message out into the world. And there's, you know, because when you name your film like this, there is a lot of people who do not like it. And we got messages, often, usually from parents who were raising small children. And, you know, I could completely understand where they were coming from. They often felt that they wanted their children to grow up feeling, you know, a lot of confidence. And, you know, if they take the term Hafu and it means half, then that means that they're less than. And so they're not good as a full Japanese person, or not as, you know, good as a full whatever else their background is. But we really just don't see it that way. We really see that, you know, it's just a term to embrace this community. And I think it just kind of, you know, goes in line with what everybody else is saying, that, you know, just so much about how empowering it has been for people to get behind this term, to feel that they can identify with this term. And, you know, ultimately, I think, at least in Japan, you know, we want it to become where it's maybe the terminology is not so prevalent anymore, that we just all become Japanese.
Well, you know what I said before, when we will have tragic experience, but it's usually from someone outside, right? When someone asks you the question, "What are you?" That tells me nothing about myself, and tells me a whole lot about the person asking. And in the case of a parent like that, I would probably encourage them to sort of really rethink what that means to them, right? You know, and that it's pejorative comes from the parent, right? That if the child is going to face that term when they're out from beneath their protection, and to understand that term from a place of empowerment, and that we will define this word, right? And maybe it's because I came out of the Black community in the 60s when, you know, Black was the pejorative, right? And then in the 60s, you know, Black power, all those things, we took that word back, we reclaimed it, and we gave it power. And we understood ourselves, right? We know that we are dark brown, we're not Black, but it was that terminology to be able to give us power in the face of people who would want to use it against us and negatively, where we had to look at everything. You know, black magic is negative magic. All the evil is black. Darkness. All those sorts of things. To be able to take that and have that sort of understanding of powerfulness, and that we can create our own realities, right? So I would work with those parents to say, this is a way in which you can empower your child, give them the tools to respond to that which would be a pejorative that would be used negative against them. In fact, their wholeness is more than the wholeness of their wholeness is really enriching, right? You know, I mean, in Japan they tried the term double for a while, because I was in the documentary doubles, right? That doesn't, to me, work in the same way that Hafu does, because you're right, Hafu was so how it came about. So again, I can't say enough from an old guy to the young generation saying, I really, really love and appreciate what you're doing, because you're allowing those children to be able to stand up and say, this is who I am. If you don't like it, there's the door.
I think even when I was wrestling with the title for One Big Hapa Family, I really wrestled with that, because that was around 2010, and there was a lot of sort of discussion around the usage of the word Hapa. And I remember, you know, I got a hold of Kip, Paul Spickard, kind of talking about, you know, should I use this? And I think what it boiled down to is actually in the film, I talk about it. You know, I talk about, you know, the Hawaiian context and everything else. And so, you know, that for me at least could bring some discussion towards the usage of the word Hapa, right? But even with Hapa Palooza, we were wrestling a lot with, like, what do we do? We brought Wei Ming Dariotis just to speak, and she wrote that article, about the essay. I think Hapa, the word of power. Is that correct? You guys remember that one? Where she, kind of talking about Hapa, and we wrestled with are we going to rebrand? Are we going to call ourselves something else? If we're the mixed festival, people are going to think we're a mixed drink festival. I don't know, right? So it's sort of like, now what? And we've struggled so much trying to figure out, if we're going to rebrand, what name would we use and how would we, identify our festival, which has, become very tricky, right? Because also Hapa in sort of the usage in North America is more of the mixed Asian or Pacific Islander context, where we wanted to be more inclusive of everybody who was mixed. So that was also sort of the tricky part there too, is that, we have a large mixed African Canadian Black community in Canada as well, and we wanted to include them. And some of them felt that the Hapa was just too, specific, right? But even look at Hapa Japan, right? That's even more specific, because now we're looking at just mixed Japanese in that festival, even though we are trying to be more inclusive of everybody as well. So I think there's a lot, as we've discussed, that it's important to discuss. And, but we're all very aware of, the power of language, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
So to build onto this, I feel like there's still the undercurrent of the last question that Erin asked, which is the hope for the future for these kinds of conversations. And I actually, if I were to continue to answer that, I would say that it's for people who are young, even like babies right now, to have leveled up to the point where it's like, as a child, you went to Loving Day celebrations. There was Kip's book on your coffee table. Like, you saw Hafu and one big Hapa family as a kid, and Curtis's TED Talk was like the dinner table conversation. Everyone knows about Tadaima, and all that stuff. And when people ask you who you are, what are you, where are you from, or whatever one of those questions, you have a really good and deep answer, to all of it, even to the level of nuance about, oh, would that make you a Hafu or a Hapa? You're like, well, there's a history of the word, and there's a history of all these projects and usage, and here's where I land on it. That I think would be a pretty wonderful place to be in for our community, where I feel like if there's a 2.0 or whatever, like the 1.0 is just doing this groundwork of like, who are we and where are we even like standing, and others can like build on that work. It's part of the reason why I respect everyone here, is because part of who I feel like I am was built on what all of you have done, and I got to like level up thanks to you. It continues, obviously. You can always like learn more. I feel like I'm always learning and I need to learn, but little kids need to have this debate and already know it by the time they're like, remember when people were like, oh yeah, the children of the future will be like coding their own websites or building their own apps by the time they're in elementary school? It's like, and this.
That's great.
We got to realize how lucky we are, privileged we are to be able to even have these discussions. We have had so much to build on to even have these. Like growing up, that's like, I can't even imagine like, whoa, being this far down the road. So, that we can even talk about this stuff is really so important to remember.
Absolutely. And I know this could go on probably indefinitely, but I am going to bring us to a close and just say thank you so much. I'm so grateful to each of you for sharing your thoughts and your work and your experience. And to everyone watching from home, thank you. I hope this is just the beginning. I know this is an ongoing conversation for all of you, but the beginning of many more conversations and unpacking. And just thank you so much. I'm really grateful. And I hope you all stay healthy, safe, and well wherever you are.
Thanks, Erin. Well.
Thank you.
Nice to see you all.
Thank you very much.